Hello, sixth graders. Mrs. Parsons here, and it is time again for another Math Mania sixth grade West Platte Elementary YouTube video on mathematics. And it's for our next lesson and sessions that we are coming into, which really means we're getting ready to start practicing the skills of fraction division. And what that simply means is we're going to start dividing fractions. Before we do that, though, I want to kind of give you an introductory video on some pieces that we need to remember about fractions. So, of course, the first things we need to remember are that there are parts to a fraction. There are certain parts to a fraction. Of course, a fraction is a number that is over the top of another number. And that top number, of course, is the numerator. And that tells you what you have in a fraction. And then there's a bottom number, which is known as the denominator. And that tells you how many there are. And this is all based on the lovely concept of a whole. So before we even begin thinking about dividing fractions, we need to remember what fractions are. And in your lovely lessons that I will give you, sixth graders, that are posted in your Google Classroom, you'll see another Google slide presentation, opening page. I then give you our vocabulary again. I show you some models of fractions right there in your Google slide presentation. There's a model of fractions and what fractions look like and how we break a whole down into fractions. I then tell you over in the vocabulary section about fractions, and fractions simply just tell us how many parts we have in a whole. That's all a fraction does. I have one marker, I snap it, I now have two parts of my marker. It's still one marker, but there would be two parts. I just split it into halves. So if I split it perfectly down the middle, I'd have one half here, but I still, if I put it together, I would have one whole marker. And that's what fractions are based on, telling us how many parts we have in a whole. Then that top number that I just showed you earlier, the numerator, the top number of that fraction tells us how many parts we have out of the whole. If I split this and I had half of it in my hand, I would have one out of the two parts. The denominator, which is the bottom number of the fraction, tells us how many parts we have in the whole. Going back to my marker, it's a whole, but if I snap it in two, I then have two parts. I have one half and another half, which are two halves, which make one whole. So hopefully that's following along. I then go on to tell you about some other vocabulary words that we're going to need to define and remember, like an improper fraction and a mixed number. But those are all located in your Google Classroom. This video that I'm making right now will be put right in there for you. And then I gave you some other videos from Khan Academy about dividing whole numbers by fractions, dividing fractions by whole numbers. And then I gave you your homework for this evening. So that's all going to be in your Google slide presentation, and it takes me back to my video about discussing fractions and remembering some important information about fractions so that when you are going through the process of dividing them, those things kind of click back to you about, well, what really is a fraction? How does a fraction really work? So you need to know that there are two parts to a fraction. The top is the numerator, tells you what you have. The bottom is the denominator, tells you how many there are, all in a whole. So if this was a whole and there's two parts in that whole and you have one of them, you have one half of the whole. And that's how fractions work. And of course, they again are just telling us parts of a whole. Now, there are a few other things you need to remember. There are such things called improper fractions, which now they're calling it a new name. They like to say it's a fraction greater than one. I'm going to write that. Miss Pages still calls it improper fraction because I'm old and I do old school things. But this is what they're now calling a fraction greater than 1. Because an improper fraction, if you recall, sixth graders, means that your numerator is greater than your denominator, which in this instant tells you that you must have more than one whole. Because if you have two parts in your denominator, that means you have two parts in your whole. And if this number is bigger on top, then it must mean you have more than one whole. And in fact, if you look at this, sixth graders, and I probably used this example before, it says you have 5 over 2, which is 5 out of 2. So if I have 5 out of 2, 1, I know I can get 5, but can I get it out of 2? Well, yes, I can get it once, but I can get it more than once. So that must mean that my fraction must be what is known as an improper fraction, which is a fraction greater than 1. Because if I had 5 and every whole only had 2 parts in it, 5 is going to give me back more than 1 whole. In fact, it's going to give me back 1 whole there, 2 holes there, and then I have 1 piece left here. Well, if every whole had 2 pieces in it, and I have 1 out of 2 left, that must mean I have half of the next whole. So an improper fraction really is a fraction greater than 1, saying that you have more than 1 whole. And in this instance, 5 over 2 really is equivalent. I see how many 2's I can get out of 5. I know I can get 2 out of 5 because 2 times 2 is 4. So I know I can get 2. And then there will be 1 left because now if I take this twice, so I subtract 2. And if I subtract 2 again, that is 4. That's going to leave me, 5 minus 4 leaves me 1. That 1 has to always go back over my denominator because then it tells me that's how many extra parts I have left before I get another whole. So in this case, I have 1 whole, I have 2 holes, and I have 1/2 of the next whole. So 5 over 2 is an improper fraction, which is a fraction greater than 1, really says that 5 over 2 is 2 1/2. That improper fraction turns into 2 holes and half of the next whole. Well, once we turn it into that, ladies and gentlemen, this lovely thing also has a special name called a mixed number. And a mixed number, as you recall again, 6th graders, is a number that has a whole and a fraction. Here is my whole, and here is my fraction. And you could just see from this opening improper fraction that I can turn that improper fraction into a mixed number by division, because fractions are division. We need to make sure we make that clear. Fractions are division. These are division lines right here. So fractions are divisions. And I can take that improper fraction, I can turn it into a mixed number. Well, just as I can turn that into a mixed number, I can take a mixed number and turn it back into an improper fraction or a fraction greater than 1. And the way we do that, the way many of the kids like to do that, is if you have 2 and you know every one of those holes has 2 parts. So here is one of those holes. Here's another one of those holes. And then here's another hole, but I don't have all of that. I only have half of it. So here's 1 hole, here's 2 holes, and I only have half of the next hole. Well, all you're simply going to do then, 6th graders, is ask yourself, how many halves do you have? Well, if you break these all up, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So right here, this 2 1/2 is equivalent to 5 halves. And that means you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 halves of your holes. And you still have, no matter what, 6th graders, 1, 2 holes and half of the next one. 5 over 2 is the same as 2 1/2. And we do have to remember those things, because when we're going to use division with fractions, you're going to be using whole numbers with fractions. You're going to be using fractions with whole numbers, fractions with whole numbers, fractions with fractions, all different kinds of combinations with fractions when we're talking about division. So these are just some vocabulary and some prior knowledge information I want you to remember, because it's going to help us as we move forward in division of fractions. So my next little piece I'm going to go to is I'm actually going to do some division of fractions. But before I do that, I want to remind us of a couple other things. We cannot forget how to add, subtract, and multiply fractions. These are things, 6th graders, that are all prior knowledge that you have to keep with you. And you are going to have to remember that when you add and subtract fractions, you must have like denominators. And when you multiply fractions, 6th graders, you just multiply straight across. You do not need like denominators, straight across. You do not need like denominators. So for instance, I'm going to say that I have 1/2 plus 3/4. If I want to add those two things together, they must have like denominators. and I have to figure out what denominator to use. Well, in this instance, I know 2 and 4 have a like denominator as in 4, because I can multiply 2 by 2 and it's going to give me 4. And if you recall, whatever we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. So this over here is 2/4. I can now add 2/4 plus 3/4. That'll give me 5/4, which is an improper fraction that I'll change to a mixed number, which is 1 and 1/4. And you've got to remember that this is 5th grade, where you added and subtracted fractions, making like denominators. You also did multiplication of fractions. I'm just going to use these same fractions, and I'm going to multiply them. I'm going to do 1/2 times 3/4. But in this case, I don't need like denominators, because in this case up here, 6th graders, these are individual parts. And this down here is where we're making groups of parts. So I don't need like denominators. Instead, I can just multiply straight across, and it's going to give me 3/8. So 1/2 times 3/4 is 3/8, because I'm going to take the halves and I'm going to make them into smaller parts. I'm going to group those pieces together. So those are things you have to keep with you as common knowledge before we go on to division. And I'm going to show you 2 division problems today with fractions. And then as we make our way throughout the year, really as we make our way throughout the week and our way throughout the year, I will then inform you, show you, guide you through the process of an algorithm, a mathematical rule, where we actually take a thing known as the reciprocal, and we're able to do this as a multiplication problem instead of division. And later on in videos, I'll show you that and discuss that with you. For today, I'm just going to show you how we're going to divide these, and you're going to see the reciprocal rule being added, but maybe not discussed as much, okay? So the first thing I'm going to show you, 6th graders, is we have 3 divided by 1/2. Now, this is usually pretty easy. Anytime we have a whole number divided by a fraction, kids can normally see that very easy. Adults can see that very easy. Because all we're going to do is we're going to take 3 models, or 3 forms, and I know that's not perfectly, I'll make this a little bit different. I don't want to make it too much bigger. So I'm going to take 3 models that are a little crooked. Okay, they're a little crooked, but you'll get the gist. I'm going to take 3 models. So there's 1 hole, 2 holes, 3 holes. And all this is asking me to do is take those holes and divide them into halves. And I like using this yellow because it's really easy to see when you divide it in half. So when I divide them in half then, 6th graders, there's half. Here's they're divided in half. Here they're divided in half. It then asks you, how many halves do you have? If you have 3 holes and you divide them into halves, how many halves do you now have? Well, I think, 6th graders, you can see that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the answer to 3 divided into halves is 6. And you can visually see that when you break it down into a model. And that's the first thing we really want 6th graders to be able to do. Can you visually see it and understand what the words then are saying? I have 3 holes and I divide them into halves. How many do I have now? Well, I have 6 halves. So you can visually see that. It gets trickier, of course, as we go along, because the next one talks about a half divided into 3. So now, 6th graders, I'm going to use another model, and I'm going to draw a hole, because we know everything is based on a hole. And in this hole, I have half. There's half of the hole. And what I want to do with that half is I want to split it into thirds. Well, since we know that everything is based on holes, when I take that half and I break it up into thirds, I'm just going to split my whole hole. I'm going to take my whole hole and split it into thirds. There we go. Because now there's 1/3, there's 1/3, there's 1/3. It started off as 1 whole. I then broke it down into a half and a half. And now I broke it into a third. Well, if I broke this half into thirds, then this half is also broke up into thirds. And so I'm going to imagine, sixth graders, now when you're watching this, you don't see a whole, you don't see a half, you don't even see thirds. You now see sixths. You see 6 parts. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. And if you want to know how much, I'm going to pick a different color here. Oh, I've used all the colors, haven't I? If you want to know, sixth graders, how many thirds are in that half, you just take one of those and you ask yourself, how much is that? Well, that right there, sixth graders, is really 1/6. So if I take a half and I divide it into thirds, it means I take the whole piece and I divide it up into thirds. And when I divide it up into thirds, this has 3 parts, this has 3 parts, and since everything is based on a whole, I have to say how many parts are there all together in that. And now, sixth graders, this whole is broke up into parts of 6. So if I have 1/2 and I divide it into 3, how much do I have in each part? I have 1/6. Now I know that sounds like, that's a lot, Mrs. P, and it is. But when you model it, sixth graders, and you know you start off as a whole, and you break it into a half, and you take each of those halves and you split them up into 3, how many parts do you have now in your whole altogether? And you have 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you want to know, if you split a half up into 3 parts, how much do you have in each part? Well, you've got 1/6 here, you've got 1/6 here, you've got 1/6 here, and so on and so on. Now that's going to lead us, sixth graders, later this week into a thing known as the reciprocal rule. And I'm going to write it here. Reciprocal rule. And that's going to lead us to a thing that lots of kids love to say, keep, switch, flip. And later in the week, I'm going to show you this in a video. Well, it's a pre-recorded video I did last year, but I'm going to show you this in a pre-recorded video that will help you understand how did you get 1/2 divided by 3 is equal to 1/6 using a reciprocal rule of keep, switch, flip. And ladies and gentlemen, in your video later this week, I will show you that rule. Right now, I just want you to be able to see how we divide fractions, thinking about modeling it, knowing what we know about fractions when we add, subtract, and multiply them. What are fractions? Improper and mixed numbers based on the numerators and denominators, what I have, what you can have. So that's just an introductory video. Later this week, I'll show you another video about division of fractions using the standard algorithm, which is a mathematical rule called the reciprocal rule. Right now, I just want you to visually, as I cover up my eyes, I want you to visually think about when you hear about dividing fractions, what do you see? When you hear about fractions being divided, what do you visually see? When you hear 3 divided into halves, 3 divided into halves, what do you visually see? Do you see 3 apples and somebody cutting them into halves and then seeing how many halves do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 6 halves now. So hopefully those kind of mental and visual pictures, sixth graders, are going to help you as we make our way through dividing fractions. So that's it for this video. Sorry it ran a little bit long again, but hopefully it'll give you a better idea and clue and understanding of division of fractions. Until the next time, sixth graders, have a great Monday.